So I'm delighted to welcome you all back to this pre-dinner session, where we are honored to have a ministerial address by Ambassador Hardeep Puri, someone who is a multilateralist, someone who has worked at the highest international offices. Multilateralist. Someone who has served as the head of the UNSC when he was representing India, someone who's worked on trade, an author, a thinker, and now someone who's entrusted with the task of managing one of the most interesting sectors, something we really touched during the day, sir. We spoke on energy, we spoke on energy security. We have a task force that is working on that as well. So he's entrusted with the charge of India's energy security and energy needs as the Minister of Petroleum and Natural Gas. And of course, he's also the Minister for Urban Affairs, something we spoke about today as well, something critical to sustainable development and climate change. Mr. Puri brings a wealth of experience in these sectors, obviously, but as an ambassador and as a diplomat in his previous life, he has traversed the world from South America to across the globe, and he brings up understanding of world affairs that is very unique. And we are truly privileged, sir, that you have agreed to speak to us this evening, and may I now request you to address us.
Thank you very much, and good evening to all of you. I've known Samir perhaps longer than most of you. He has a certain way of getting things done, which means that he's able to exercise his margin of persuasion. And I kept protesting that I have 5 different functions in 5 different parts of the city, but you know, he left me no choice. But at the end of the day, I'm delighted to be here. I'm saying all this only because I want to apologize for my delayed arrival. Why do I think, and that's something I want to speak to you about, why is the Indian G20 presidency a sui generis one of a kind? And I want to ask that question myself, and I want to respond to it in order to provoke a discussion. One, I think that many of us tend to take the G20 as a given, as something that's been around. That is not the case always. The G20 arose and was established when the world economy was in a crisis following the world economic crisis in 2008 or thereabouts. The crisis itself emanated from the subprime lending sector of the US real estate market, but given the high degree of integration of the global economy in some parts, the contagion spread very quickly. Why am I saying that? Because I recall that when the crisis was upon us, all the established agencies which should have had the intellectual heft to address that crisis were, if I may submit, and I hope I see a lot of friends around me and I hope they don't take it amiss, their respective organizations, whether they were working for the fund, the bank, the WTO, I'm not saying it because I saw Harsh here, but otherwise, they were frankly at a loss as to how to address the crisis. And as happens ever so often, when you don't know what to do, then your response is large and comprehensive. So the G20 used to meet at finance ministers level. I think that meeting thereabouts was in Sao Paulo. And they decided, let's take this group and elevate it to head of state, head of government level. And thus was born the G20. The G20 was born in a crisis situation. And I think it goes to the strength of the G20 that the G20 Certainly at the London summit, which was I think 2010, it was able to address the crisis, and within, perhaps the response time should have been shorter, but it was able to calm issues down, and the world felt safer as a result of the G20's action. Now, my submission to you is that the next crisis after that one is the one that we are facing today. So, this G20 presidency is essentially, in terms of the core, the kernel, very different from the other G20 presidencies, because India assumes the mantle, its presidency, at a time when there is genuinely a crisis. What do I describe as a crisis? I'm not trying to dramatize, but we are facing at least three that I know of, crises. One, all relating to 3 Fs: food, fertilizer, and fuel. You could have a separate session devoted to each one of those. About the energy crisis, about fuel, I know a little bit, and I'm going to share some thoughts with you. Is India willing to address that crisis? And my submission to you is frontally. And I don't say this because during the course of the pandemic, you had India producing what? 220 crore doses of vaccines which were distributed free, not only within the country, but outside. I think our credentials as a responsible global citizen were also underlined in that process. Most G20 presidencies tend to look at the membership of the G20 and invite a few special guests. But this G20 presidency is doing something very different. And before I come and pay a compliment to my friends Sujan and Samir and all of you who are associated with T20, only about an hour ago, I was addressing something called the Voice of the Global South. But this is a G20 initiative which the Honorable Prime Minister conceptualized, addressed, and then several of us did independent session, the Finance Minister, I think the Environment Minister and others, and I did the energy session. Who were the participants? Overall, I don't know how many there will be. I can tell you in my group there were about 12 or 13 ministers, Deputy Prime Minister, one country, Energy Minister. These are not the countries which are members of G20, but have a very important role to play. So the horizontal spread in terms of participation is very different in this G20 from others. So I could go on telling you how this G20 presidency is different. But I want to come back to where you guys fit in. When the multilateral system, and I'll hold this against Samir all my life, that he called me a multinationalist, which you know, his mind is going towards the MNCs. No, if I'm multi-anything, it is multilateral, is good. As long as we are clear on that, now I'll forget that. Look, the international system, or rather let me use the word multilateral system, was again conceived in moments of crisis. When the San Francisco conference took place in 1945, the world was still at war. And it was that feeling of being embattled and being in a crisis which I think resulted in new institutions being born. Am I saying to you that absent the crisis, it would have taken longer? You bet, that's what I'm saying. Try and put today the UN has 193 members, take half of them, put them in a room and tell them to negotiate. They will negotiate till the cows come home, and probably if you get 90 intelligent people sitting in a room, the sum total of their individual intelligence put together will be an incomprehensible and a document which very few people will understand. But when you have a crisis, that crisis has the imperative built into it of producing the result that is required. That's the submission I'm making to you. The multilateral system, which was born in 1945, if you look at the UN Charter, it has two parts essentially. One is, it is a, if you might call it, a contract between sovereign states, but I think an equally important, and in today's day, a far more important aspect is the second part, we the people. Now, what is we the people? I think it is civil society, non-governmental organizations, and think tanks. So I think the role that the think tank plays, again, Samir will say modesty doesn't come to me, but I've had the privilege of working in think tanks. Some of them are pure think tanks, some of them are what you call do tanks or battle tanks. And if you have the power of the value, the strength of ideas, and you are in a position to marshal those ideas and thoughts in order to address the challenges that you face. And what are the challenges? I think the challenges are known. I'm not going to the three crisis points, fuel, fertilizer, and fuel. I'm not going to them. But look at the other challenges. Climate. Basic architecture of the multilateral system as it exists. Do I have your permission to be a little direct and blunt? When the United Nations was born, there were two competing philosophies that went into its design. Today there are many pillars. One pillar is peace and security. The other pillar, if I may, for want of a better thing, is development. And a lot of other, some fantastic work is done by the multilateral system. Some of it by the multilateral system directly, some by association with the multilateral system, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Sustainable Development Goals, much better than the Millennium Development Goals. And today the overall narrative is going in that direction. But let's say one of the primary purposes of the United Nations is peace and security. What is the design of that architecture which deals with peace and security? It is to take the relic of the Second World War, where the operating philosophy was to the victor belong the spoils, and you created a Security Council of 5 members, which essentially has a veto on this. Now, the cynic amongst you might ask, why is the Security Council so important? I'd be ready to dismiss the Security Council, but there is a ground reality out there. The Security Council is the only authorized and designated entity in the global system which has the authority to make a determination on whether there exists a threat to peace and security. A very important statement which we lose sight of. In the absence of that determination being exercised by the Security Council, any number of countries, most likely the ones who have dominant political and economic power, would just get up and say, I think there is a threat to peace and security and I will take countermeasures. But the whole idea was to have a multilateral sanctity bordering on something much more noble, so that those determinations are not made in a casual manner. And that authority, that designation on what constitutes a threat to peace and security also carries with it a concomitant power to authorize countermeasures under chapters 7 and 8 of the Charter. Now, the use of force, this is what it's all about, is not mentioned in a blunt manner. You talk about countermeasures in a way. I think that's a very important thing. Now, wind back. Look at the number of times the veto has been exercised by the Security Council, and make an analysis clinically as a think tank. How many times was the use of veto justified? I'm one of those who say that in certain circumstances the veto is justified, and let me explain why to you. Number one, if you apprehend or you fear that you are going to be faced with a situation where a mass atrocity is likely to be committed, and by mass atrocity, I mean all of them: genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. I think the international community should step in and take such measures as are necessary to prevent that kind of atrocity being committed. But putting those extreme conditions aside, look at the way this whole thing has evolved. I'm not going to get into a political judgmental game here. All I can tell you is we would not be in the mess that we are in today. I'm not talking about today as in 13 January 2023, but I'd say go back 5-10 years. The fact is you have a Security Council which is paralyzed. And the minute a permanent member of the Security Council ends up being directly or indirectly involved, you can't get anything through the Security Council. So your peace and security track is effectively a non-starter, given these situations. So if you have to really contribute to the design of and I'm not coming at this from the Indian vantage that, reform the Security Council, India deserves to be a permanent member. I'm too self-assured and arrogant to tell you whether the UN or anybody wants it or not, India will be a permanent member. Not because this is going to be reformed, but either the systems break down and countries which can do the heavy lifting will have to do it. Whether it is disaster relief or it is responses to health pandemics, you don't need to be a permanent member of the Security Council to do that. You do it in your own right because you have a national system and ethos which will make you do it. This is where you guys come in. I think I see friends from large number of countries. In all our countries, no matter what our political system, the value and the force of ideas is exceptionally strong. Therefore, I'm not talking about, I don't know whether T20 is going to be a coalition or not. Maybe one day Sudan can come and brief me. But I think you have a great opportunity here to discuss, coalesce amongst yourselves. And I'm only giving you the political peace and security dimension. I could speak with equal degree of passion on the world trading system. What was the world trading system designed for? In Havana, you were looking at the potential of setting up an international trade organization which would be universal. What did you end up with doing? Because the Havana Charter was not ratified except for Chapter 4, I think, Harsh will correct me, which deals with trade and tariffs and etc. That became the interim committee for the International Trade Organization, ICITO, which became the GATT. Now, when you converted the GATT into the WTO, a simple question I want to ask: how far is that system embodied in the WTO today able to address the challenges of today? When the pandemic took place, what did any of them do? I'm not talking about the specialized agencies of the UN. I'm not talking about the Fund Bank, etc. Everybody had a theory, but somebody had to step up. Move from there to climate. Move from there to any of the other major challenges. So I'm going to conclude by a very simple submission to you that the multilateral system, which was created in 1945 in the form of the UN, the Fund, the Bank, GATT, subsequently the WTO, and all that goes with it, is desperately crying out for reform. And that's not the reform of individual institutions, that is the larger issue of reforming the multilateral system. And I frankly can't think of anyone better to start addressing those questions than a group of international think tanks brought together under the G20. Now, I've partly flattered you. That was in response to this Samir saying nice things about me. But I've also hopefully provoked you. I don't know how much time we have. We have a little time. So if you want to have a question and answer or exchange, yeah, we can sit there. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
good. So this is the time for you to ask questions to the minister. Of course, sir, we would like to hear about, as the energy minister, as the petroleum and natural gas minister, what is your prognosis and how do you see the next years play out?
Well, I can, again, be very, very candid with you. The global energy challenges are on us for a variety of reasons. I think people forgot, most people in policy-making roles, that in order to navigate through the pandemic, most economies, certainly the successful larger economies, put in trillions of dollars through stimulus packages into the economies. These were inflationary, to say the least. If you add high oil prices to that, then that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's no longer inflationary. Then you're looking at the big R. What are you looking at at the globe today? You are looking at the big R. There are some bright spots. The United States, which is a $20+ trillion economy, it had quarter-on-quarter negative growth, but it's otherwise resilient. It's looking good. Parts of Europe, I wish I could characterize parts of Europe with the same degree of confidence, but I can't, and you know why. If you look at the developing world, you have India. India will grow at 6% plus, close to 6.5%, even more. But then, again, it's an isolated case. Most others are looking at real challenges. I mean, the challenges of food, fertilizer, and I just mentioned a little bit about fuel. Let me tell you about fuel. It's very simple. The world consumes 100 million barrels a day. Those who produce are the major producers of crude will tell you they don't determine the price. Don't take them seriously. They determine the quantity they release, so that in turn determines the price. If there's a 1 million barrel shortfall, the price will go not from 70 to 80, it'll go to somewhere else. And if you think that you have access to a superior form of understanding of the global economy, with Venezuela under sanctions of some form, Iran not being able to release its oil, and if you want to put Russia under a price cap or something, that takes 3 of the largest suppliers off. Now, it's very simple. If everybody stops buying from, let's say, Russia, hypothetically, and starts buying only from those who have oil in the market, you're not looking at $120, you're looking at $250. So that's the reality. Now, that's why there is a complete mismatch between those who talk about climate change and those who are in the real world who have to navigate energy. I have seen it in Davos, I have seen it at ADIPEC, but I am greatly reassured that at the end of the day, policymakers are sensible people and they know, put the rhetoric on one side, they'll be able to navigate it sensibly.
Some questions, you can walk up to the mic, which are in front of you, but let me start with my friend from Moscow, Fyodor.
Thank you very much.
Can you briefly introduce yourself and where you come from, and then ask the question?
Thank you very much, Minister. My name is Fyodor Wojtolowski.
Can you raise the mic?
Yeah. My name is Fyodor Wojtolowski. I'm director of Institute of World Economy and International Relations of Russian Academy of Sciences. I have a question. You said a lot of right things about the crisis, about the situation with international institutions and multilateralism. And I absolutely agree with your assumption that India, Brazil, and in the future, one of African countries are the major powers who deserve more than any others permanent membership in the UN Security Council. But my question is concerning the World Trade System. How can we think about developing multilateral and justifiable international trade system based on WTO and other international institutions in this situation when the practices of use of sanctions, limitations, tariffs, and mercantilist practices of new times, new era are developing and flourishing, and what we can do with it.
Let me start by saying I think yours is a very profound observation, and I don't think me alone or anyone has all the answers. When systems are not functioning, there can be a variety of reasons. One is that you have a system based on the rule of law somewhere out there, and the designated body makes a recommendation legally tenable, and the country to whom it's addressed says, thank you very much, but I don't think I'm going to accept what you're going to say. That's one theory. I'm not going to any example. The second is that an existing system, I'm not talking about now, many years ago, was manipulated so that the interests, let's say hypothetically, of some of the weaker trading partners were not allowed to be addressed and relief provided. So if they became competitive in a particular sector, well, you first coerced them individually, and then when you found that individual coercion didn't work, you worked out an abrogation or a derogation from the free trade rules of the system and said, this particular sector is outside the rules, it's a new rules. I'm talking about textiles and clothing. I mean, it's not... So there are these things. Then you went into another round, I'm talking about trade now, where I said, you know, take it or leave it. It's a multilateral organization, but if everybody else doesn't want to join, good, I'll set up a plurilateral thing. I'll have a small grouping of 4 or 6. What does it mean? It means essentially that, and maybe that's going to be the wave of the future, 4 or 6 of you join, we'll set up a select exchange. So what you are witnessing today is not new. It's been coming for a long time. And there have been people, predecessors of Samir and Sudan and all my friends here, who've been talking about addressing multilateral issues. The concept, the design, the processes. Has the time come now? Somebody, when I used to be permanent representative in New York, told me something very interesting. He said, Ambassador, you come here too soon. I said, why? He said, come 10 years later, when the system becomes really bad, then you'll have a better chance of reforming it. I don't know. I think that's a very defeatist sort of a line. But there are people who think that you have to really reach the, situation where everybody becomes despondent, is very negative, and then you say, okay, sit down and talk. I genuinely believe that you should not allow that to happen. You should start addressing multilateral issues before the system cracks up. Just now you've got fault lines. You've got individual countries having doubts. You've got groups of countries having doubts. A system, they will say, works to the advantage, in favor of some. Forget about all that. That's all daily negotiation. But I think you've got a great opportunity. What do you need to do? I've had discussions. I don't have the liberty or the bandwidth to deal with multilateral issues anymore. I mean, I deal with it now in the energy sector or in urban affairs, and I've got a plate full. But I think there are a lot of good, well-meaning people here who you can utilize your expertise, your vantage position in think tanks, to have a serious dialogue as to what needs to be done.
Can you introduce yourself and ask a question?
Sure. Thank you, Minister Puri. Arpit Chaturvedi here from Global Policy Insights based out in New Delhi. My question is that there's been a lot of talk around the fact that the developed countries haven't done their fair share in sustainable transitions. They haven't contributed enough funds, etc. And my question is that beyond naming and shaming, what insight do we have on their incentives, and how might we change the developed countries' incentives to really, put the money where the mouth is? And or do you think it is going to be a perpetual sort of a prisoner's dilemma between developing and developed countries, or will the developing countries anyway have to step up and do this? So that's my question.
No, I have a slightly unconventional and probably a not a very likable view on, in terms of the answer I have to your question. I think if developing countries say that, you know, polluters pay principle, you do your thing first, I think that's not in their own interest, that line. I mean, you also owe a duty to your next generation.
Yes.
And if you go on blaming someone else and everybody dies of toxicity, who's going to gain? I'm not trying to let the those who have to make contributions off the hook. I'm not trying to do that. But I think, therefore, our Prime Minister, when was it, at Paris, he just decided to change the traditional Indian line, and he said, no, I'll step forward. And that's one of the best things that has happened as far as my policy goes. I've been a civil servant for 39 years, and then I was doing think tanking. I was chairman of RAIs, by the way, what Sachin does. So I was also with a think tank in New York. So I've seen all the worlds. I think what he did in the flight between, where was it, London and Glasgow?
Yeah. It's Scotland to Paris, I think.
No, I know. When he was going for COP26, I think,
that's
he
right.
changed the government line. I mean,
G7 to...
Yeah, I hope I'm not saying anything else, but I was talking to people before that. I had I think it was Senator Kerry who called on me when I was housing minister and before PM's visit. He said, you know, you must do this. I didn't take it seriously. I knew that the Indian line was not etched in stone. I mean, the Prime Minister stepped forward and said, wait a minute. We the developed countries have to do what they have to, but we are going to do something meanwhile. So the obligations and commitments we took, we are very serious about it. No matter what the global crisis is, it is not going to be allowed, even to the smallest extent, for our commitments on green sustainability to be diluted even by a millimeter. And therefore, we are stepping on the gas on green hydrogen, on biofuel mixing, and even though our overall commitment net zero is 2070, most of our oil companies have taken, what, 2040, 2046?
Correct.
You can't do better than that.
Thank you so
Shikhar,
much, Minister.
I'll come to you. And can I request Ana Tony or someone of my colleagues from Brazil to come forward as well? Because there's a Brazil connection here. Shikhar, over to you.
Thank you. Good evening, Minister. I'm Shikhar Bhasin. I'm a researcher at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. And I'm actually very glad that you're here with us when things do seem to be falling apart. It's great to hear from you. Given that a lot of the ineffectiveness that you've alluded to of the multilateralism entities, what is your hope in what India can do in trying to influence the norms as we conclude G20 later this year?
Influence the norms related to?
Well, the membership of all of these countries are a part of the G20, right? They are in the decision-making seats. So how do we intend, or what should our hope really be? What are we looking forward to at the end of this year to feel like multilateralism is perhaps back on track in being responsive to the multiple crises that you've spoken about?
Can we revive multilateralism through the G20? How do we?
Oh, I have no doubt. I have no doubt. I've never seen so many meetings taking place within a compressed short period of time. I mean, I've got other pieces of work to attend to, but I even see Lakshmi, my God, the number of G20 things she's doing, other people are doing. I mean, if you start with the objective, which is clear that you need to address the challenges of multilateralism without saying you need to reform multilateralism. The minute you use the word reform, some guys will dig in. Some of my biggest supporter friends today used to tell me, don't talk about reform because we have earned a permanent membership because we were the victors in the Second World War. So I told one of them in a lighter mood after a evening session, I said, I don't know who wrote your history, but I could easily make out that you actually didn't win the Second World War. I mean, somebody helped you win it, but I was lighter vein. Look, everybody looks at the multilateral system in terms of what his or her country can get out of it, okay? Which is fair, which is fair. You conduct trade on that basis, you conduct political negotiations on that basis, but sometimes you tend to forget that a genuinely effective multilateral system is the best guarantee you have against abuse of power, abuse of dominant position, and something which is public good. So I can understand the really powerful not wanting to reform the system. But when I find the not so strong also reforming, is because they think the status quo is very good. But my submission to you, the status quo is actually cracking up. I mean, if this continues for a while, every time that you get into a problem, don't go to someone who's the empire, because the empire is blowing a whistle saying, hey, nobody's listening to me.
Please, introduce yourself, your institution, and ask the question.
Ambassador Vera Torstensen from Brazil. You remember me? You
Yeah,
were
can you
together.
bring the mic
I remember you very well.
Thank you. Look, Ambassador, we are talking today a lot about the coupling, the United States and China, trying to split the world. My question to you is, in this scenario, do you envisage two different trade systems? And the next question is, what do you think Brazil, India, and other developing countries, emerging countries should do with this scenario?
The first part is that, do you imagine a dual-track trading system, China, US, dominating two different tracks?
The trade system.
And what should emerging economies do? We, Brazil and India and others, how do we gain more voice agency in these debates?
No, I'm very happy to see my friend of many years standing, because I told you I served as ambassador to Brazil between 2006 and 2008, and we met otherwise. Look, I say this with a sense of responsibility. I have never been persuaded by this kind of talk. And I heard it earlier. When I was Secretary Economic Relations in Delhi, people used to talk about a G2 diarchy. I think I've told Samir over many sessions, forget about it. Just forget about it. I mean, countries will react in their own way. I mean, no, I'm not saying that you can't get issue-based coalitions between the Chinese and the Americans, or the Chinese and the Europeans. Of course you'll get issue-based coalition when you make an assessment that's in your interest. But to talk about diarchy, alliance, I'm not persuaded. I think the systems are too
Interconnected, interdependent.
and also very different to each other. I mean, if one perceives the other as a rising power posing a threat, then even though you make a lot of money, you're going to sit back and say, hey, wait a minute, let me withdraw my investments in core sectors. And there's nothing like a pandemic to teach you a few lessons. I'm not saying a pandemic is a good thing. I think I was civil aviation minister, and I know what it is to navigate literally through a pandemic. But, supply lines, etc., people become wiser when they see these challenges and see these disruptions. As between India and Brazil, I've been a great supporter of India and Brazil, because I think these are two countries with in many ways, a similar kind of development challenge. I had the privilege of being ambassador when President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was president last time. I've had the good fortune of receiving his, guidance. He came to India, and, the rest is history. I mean, during that period, we did very well. I'm not saying we didn't do well later, but I think Brazil and India have many interests in common, and I don't just mean the G4. I mean, in the trading system, I used to say when I was a young diplomat in Geneva, I'd just gone there, I'm talking about 1981, as early as that. I went to my ambassador. I know some of you have heard the story. I said, what do I do? It's a very complicated thing, just being, you're not even, I don't know how many years old I was, but 28 years old, something, 29. I mean, thrown into a complex negotiation and asking, I told my ambassador, what do I do in case I'm not following? Those days you didn't have iPhone. He said, let's listen to what the Brazilians are saying. Stay within that band. That was the kind of convergence we had. Even now, if you take this away, if you take some of the other stuff away, there's a great amount of, convergence there in terms of our objectives, etc. I learned my ethanol from Brazil. When I went there, within a few months of arriving, I met the head of Unica, which is the cooperative entity which deals with ethanol. And the then president told me, he said, Ambassador, if India joins Brazil and the United States, we could make ethanol an internationally traded commodity. And today, I mean, today we are one of the top producers of ethanol in the world. We are going from 10% biofuel blending to 20%. And I'm telling you what is already in the public domain. We intend to utilize our G20 presidency to have an international biofuel alliance. So there's a lot going for countries like that.
So now last two questions, I'll turn to my friend Andre, and then I'll invite a friend from area. So Andre, first to you.
Many thanks, Samir, and many thanks, Minister, for your presentation. I'm Andre de Melo Souza. I'm from the Institute for Applied Economic Research, which is a Brazilian governmental think tank. I very much value multilateralism, and I fully agree with you that we need to reform our institutions. However, institutions are sticky, and those who now hold power, they don't give it away or share it easily. And moreover, even those institutions that have been reformed, oftentimes they give formal representation to developing countries such as ours, but they don't really give influence in decision making. So a seat at the table may not be sufficient in terms of these reforms. So I would ask you, how do you think the reform should proceed? And for that purpose, do we have any concrete examples of major international institutions that have been successfully reformed that maybe can guide us or at least provide some sort of a model to follow? Thank you.
Have incumbents ceded pace in any institution in the world before to newcomers and new voices?
Not that I've heard of. Colonial powers don't even leave their, colonies. I'm not saying that all of them have to be driven out through a movement which is revolutionary. No. But I think you don't need to put up a fight for everything. There comes a time in the international narrative when people realize, look, it's not worth it. I'm not used to name calling. But it's a fact that many permanent members over the years, both those aspiring to be permanent members and those who are permanent members, perceptions on their being on that body have given rise to very different emotional things. I've been telling you let me talk about aspiring countries. When it comes to one large continent, I asked once, I had a very interesting discussion. I said, how does so-and-so look? He said, that country could look on a good day. I said, what do you mean? He said, they've done very well in a particular thing, but no. Are you seriously trying to tell me that a country which at the end of the Second World War, when the philosophy was to the victor belong the spoils, but over the years, its own terms of engagement with countries in its neighborhood has changed. It is no longer a member of regional grouping. You ask them themselves. They won't bring this. So I think you don't need to bring it to a point of crisis where you say, I think if somebody seriously starts a movement towards, first of all, you don't need a movement. You need a serious discussion. Can you sincerely say that the composition of that body today, I'm only talking about Security Council as an example, seriously reflects the global situation today? Tomorrow if there's a crisis and you leave it to those permanent members to do some serious lifting, other than one or two, I don't think the other three will even volunteer to be part of the effort. So you have the answer there. So, but I agree with you, nobody has ever left the high table themselves. Normally there's an elegant way of doing it.
Create a new table.
Create a new table, or you sit down with them, they invite you, then you tell them the dishes are very palatable here, also in the next one. It happens in a much more elegant way.
Final question, sir, from my friend from area.
I'm Anbu from IRIA, Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia.
You have to bring the mic closer.
Yes, I'm Anbu from IRIA, Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, based in Jakarta. And my inquiry, Minister, is about the urban affairs, urbanization and the smart cities. I think by 2050, more than 70% of the population will be living in the urban areas. We need to provide the more infrastructure. And And also this city is becoming a part of engines of the growth. And here there is a lot of environmental problems and the social inequality. And then here we have that smart city, the application of the digital technologies to improve these services and the living standards. How do you find this role of smart cities in the future of growth, and as well as what will be the agenda for the G20 agenda for the smart cities? Thank you.
You know, there is a separate Urban 20 agenda, so I'm not going to digress into that. But I just want to draw your attention that there are 3 or 4 separate issues which your comment necessitates a response on. First of all, the Indian Smart Cities Mission. This is a project that we started in June 2015, where following a commitment that the Bharatiya Janata Party had made in the manifesto for the 2014 election, we said that if we come to power, we will set up 100 new smart cities. That was a good few intelligent guys sitting in a room and doing drafting without knowing what they were talking about fully. When we were elected in 2014, we suddenly discovered that if you use the word 100 new smart cities, then you mean you have to have 100 greenfield smart cities from scratch. So we said that was never the idea, because there are a lot of old cities which need to be smartified. So what is a smart city? It has 2 or 3 different features. One is you use what is called an area-based development, ABD. Like New Delhi Municipal Corporation is a smart city. Or you have a greenfield model, like Raipur in, where is it? Chhattisgarh. Or you have some kind of a hybrid model, but in each of these, the proposals for the projects that you want to take up in those smart cities came from the applicants in a competition mode. We didn't decide that this would be a smart city there. We asked people to bid, and in that process, a selection took place. What distinguishes a smart city from any other city? It uses the most modern technology, state of the art, for civic amenities. What am I saying? That if you go, for instance, if you come with me to Indore, which is one of the cleanest cities in the world, not just in India, it has a huge room full of computers, bright youngsters. It's like a NASA war room. And where through technology you've got CCTV cameras all over the place, you can monitor if the garbage truck has picked up the garbage, where is it has gone, truck, absolutely state of the art. And in my ministry, Nirman Bhavan, which deals with housing and urban, I have what is called the Urban Observatory. Come there if you have some time, I'll show it to you. You can watch every project being monitored on a real-time basis from that room. When the Prime Minister wanted an monitoring of the 6 lighthouse projects, he did it on real time with satellite imagery and drones, etc., to do that. During the pandemic, the smart cities, it's called an Integrated Command and Control Center, ICCC. These became war rooms for COVID management, and they did a fantastic job. Now, my objective always was that in all the 100 smart cities, we needed ICCs. Now we've got all of them, 100 in place. A lot of people seem to mix that up with the overall urban agenda. No, these were 100 cities which were selected. Will we get more? I don't know. Many other state governments have utilized the smart city model without getting funding. You see, the smart city model is very interesting. Total project cost is not very much. I think 205,000 crores, out of which the center's allocation is about 99,000 crores, and 45%, I stand subject to be corrected, comes from public-private partnership. Now, you have the option of doing the same thing yourself. So many cities in India, the state government say there's something very good going, we'll do it. We don't need the from the central listing. How much of the Indian population will be living in urban areas? I can give you a little perspective. In 1947, when we became an independent country, 17% used to live in urban areas. Then the population base was 350 million. Today, when a census comes, I think you'll discover that by 2030, by the time you finish Agenda 2030 or the Sustainable Development Goals, you will have something like 40% or 600 million people staying there. My predecessor, who went on to become vice president, he used to use a term, urban renaissance. I'm much more modest. I use the word rejuvenation. We are building, according to McKinsey, 700 to 900 million square meters of urban space every year, which is equivalent of a Chicago. So if India is building one Chicago every year, that gives you an idea of how much urban space is being built and rebuilt. Delhi, the population, 2 crore kitna hota hai? 200 million, 200 million. 20 million, okay. Out of the 20 million, we have work in progress now and in the coming years where 13.5 million of Delhi's residents will have new homes. Whether it comes from jahan jhuggi, wahi makan, low-cost housing, cross-subsidized, you know, where you call them informal settlements. Here they still use a pejorative term, slums. We are rebuilding those, resettling people. The Honorable Prime Minister gave keys to several of the beneficiaries of the 3,000 flats in east of Kailash. We have many more such projects in pipeline. So India is being rebuilt. Urban space already is contributing to the bulk of the GDP. I don't remember offhand, 65% already? Two-thirds of our GDP comes from the urban space. So the demographic shifts which will take place from the semi-urban to the urban or from the rural to tier 2 and 3 cities, the connectivity, it's some fantastic amount of demographic changes are taking place, and India will adjust to those.
So thank you very much, Minister. We spoke about the international order, multilateralism, energy, urban affairs, and of course trade. Please join me in applauding the Minister for his contribution. And sir, there's a small token from the T20 for you to remember us by.
By the way, you guys will go for dinner. I still have another meeting with the US Energy Secretary.
So they should apologize to you.
No, they shouldn't. You should. Anyway, it's great catching up with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much.